Okay, so I'm creating this new video today to cover a CSS feature that is supported by most browsers recently. So if you go to the Can I Use website for CSS Grid, you can see most browsers are supported now, and looking at the date relative for when this was first supported, it's very recent, around June 2017, that it's been supported. And this is basically quite important because in front end development, one of the most difficult parts of doing the styles is the layout of the page. So CSS Grid takes a massive headache away from working with responsive layouts, complicated grid systems, and generally makes it easier to put things on a web page where you would expect them to be, and it's just a big help. So looking at one of my previous projects, you can see this layout was done using CSS Grid. Ultimately, I think using the regular options available, such as display block, display inline block, this would have taken me probably 20 times as long to put together. Even with simple CSS, I am using this with a combination of SASS, but even in simple CSS, you can quickly put together quite complicated layouts without the actual code behind the styling being complicated. So I was actually surprised that I couldn't find any videos on YouTube or any source code on GitHub about this. I realise it's quite recent, but considering how simple it is, I decided to actually go ahead and do that myself. So I've created a project, the GitHub link will be in the description, that basically shows a simple SASS mixin for creating a grid layout. And it simply goes like this. So the mixin is called grid, and all you need to do to include it is just the SASS include followed by the mixin name. Basically, there's two parameters. One's how many columns you'll have, one is how many rows. So as you can see from this page, I've basically, if I inspect element, I've got a div with the class of content and then 4 content blocks. So looking at the SASS, it's a 12-column grid. So same as you'd expect in Bootstrap, set to 3 rows. And also for each of these blocks, I'm using the new syntax for declaring grid length. So breaking this down into a more understandable classic terms, if I'm simulating a Bootstrap layout of 12 columns, this rule here basically tells the content to span 3 columns, as you can plainly see. So with this layout, just to demonstrate how powerful it actually is, I'll show these blocks being changed in size and moving around. So simply setting these back to span 1. And if I recompile this in SASS, once I find the command, sorry, I just need to double check where I've actually placed that. So I've placed that in the source directory. So that's my SASS recompiled. So if I reload that page, you can now see that these 4 blocks take up a third of the page. You can also see there's actually a scroll bar, even though the content's not taking up that much room, and it's because I've got it set to 3 rows. Currently, that will actually, the entire page will basically resize to fit what would be 3 times the height of the current content. So we could get rid of this by simply reducing the row down to 1 and recompiling again. So as you can see, the scroll bar is now gone. And maybe if we want each piece of content to take up half a row, and also change that to 2 rows, since that's ultimately how much room they'd take up. If I recompile, you can see that now fits correctly. And also, if I change this back to, let's just say 4, but this time I'm actually going to add in a new div. So this will still be within the context of the content div, but this won't have the rule applied for how many columns it spans. So by default, it will be expected to span 1 column. So if I just put in a sample div here and recompile, so if I inspect this element, you can see that only takes up 1 column, whereas the other ones take up 4. So this is extremely flexible for creating any layouts and being able to quickly alter the layout without it affecting the web page too much. So if you look at the source code for the actual mixin, so that would be in _grid.sass. So you can see I've got the mixin declared at the top with the 2 parameters, columns and rows. So it's using this new display grid rule, which goes on the container. And then there's several other rules to basically state the constraints of the grid. So autoflow dense, this is a feature you can only really see on my implementation, where all these grid items are not actually in order. So like the numbers you can see represent each element in order, and as you can see, the numbers are kind of all over in this grid, and that's because you can actually set positioning within the grid. So you can swap out the position of one element with another. So while that's out of the context of this video, it's ultimately useful to have that rule to allow the layout to adapt to positioning. Excuse me. So the next 2 rules are template columns and template rows. So this basically states how many columns and rows the grid will have, and using this new sub rule of repeat, you can basically say how many free spaces the columns and rows will take up. So if you've got the template columns set to 1 free space, that means it'll be a 1 column layout. This is just a more simple syntax to understand setting the amount of columns and rows. There is other ways of doing it, but this is ultimately the most slimline way. And grid gap is just an equivalent of padding for a grid. So again, the source code is available for this. I'll leave a link in the description, and I hope people find this useful. And that's it.